Have you noticed? Women, young and old, are embracing singledom. I might be ahead of the curve because I've never been married or in a committed relationship. It wasn't always by choice, however. In my 20s and 30s, I long ached for love. To the boys, I loved that. Didn't love me back, sure. There was the holiday romance with the bartender I met at Club Med. He said his name was Fantastico. And yes, he was. As well as serving up cocktails and performing in the nightly variety show for guests, Fantastico claimed to channel the spirit of an ancient sage. I know. Nuts. It was the 80s, and the New Age movement had run amok. My week with Fantastico was a screen-worthy holiday romance. Except for the ending. I never heard from him again. Devastated, I can still feel the ache in my stomach from crying so hard for days. Then there was the cop I dated off and on for almost 2 years. I waited and waited some more, hoping he'd realize I was the one he'd give up his philandering ways for. Eventually, I came to my senses, thank God, when he was fired for fraternizing with known criminals. Typically, I'd chase after men who weren't interested in me and run away from the few that were. Love was hard, I'd tell myself. The harder it is to get, the more love it brings, unaware that this wasn't a normal or healthy way to start a relationship. Only the therapist I could never afford knows for sure why I self-sabotaged myself. A lack of love and romance seems to run in my family, though at least for the women. My oldest sister used to tell me she wasted her 20s on men. After she turned 30, she never dated again. I think our parents had something to do with it. Blame it on the parency. Don't think my father wanted to be a husband and father. At least, it sure didn't seem like it to me. I wondered if he loved or even cared about us, as he often tease and chastise us and talk over us as if we weren't in the room. And he never laughed, and rarely smiled. Just a stern, stiff, serious grin. And my mother? She seemed overwhelmed by the task. Or maybe she was just done being a housewife by the time I came along. The youngest of 4, always negative and critical. The only advice my mother ever gave me about men was that they're only out to take advantage of women. She must have based this opinion on her marriage, as I never sensed love or even camaraderie between my parents. It was always my father's way or the highway. My father left my mother for another woman after my brother and 2 older sisters moved out. She cried herself to sleep every night for a year after that. I couldn't understand why, as I'd thought she'd have been happy after he left. I sure was. Because once he was gone, the disquietude and heaviness in our home was too. But it was just my mother and me now, and she was in no state to take care of me, an emotionally immature 13-year-old. I was left to finish raising myself as my inconsolable mother grieved the loss of a marriage she wasn't even happy in. I made bad choices, constantly searched for the answer as to why I couldn't find a relationship. Some friends told me that any man would be lucky to have me as a girlfriend, but ironically, perhaps coincidentally, they didn't know of any men they would introduce me to. Others would say, it just takes one. I held on to that hope that one day, just like Rhoda, who finally found her guy Joe in the Mary Tyler Moore Show spin-off, I'd have a screenplay-ready story to tell the grandkids. Someone did come along in my late 30s, and I thought he was it, the one I'd been patiently waiting for, my whole life. I don't know if it was my remaining viable eggs desperate to be fertilized or his mesmerizing Windex blue eyes, but I was dangerously hooked. Of course, he wasn't the one. How could anyone live up to the fantasy created in my head? Instead, he was a two-faced sociopath. Closing in on 40, my heart felt beyond repair, and my mental health was at an all-time low. An unexpected epiphany around this time. I saw The Story of Us, a movie about a couple on the verge of divorce. Hollywood prefers happy endings, so when Michelle Pfeiffer has a change of heart and begs Bruce Willis to come home, they return to their marital bliss. After the movie, I plodded back to my car, reflecting on how the relationship portrayed in the movie seemed completely foreign, even unappealing. It's not going to happen for me. I'm not cut out for relationships. Why would I want that life? My most deep-seated fear was more than likely coming to fruition. I would always be single. I felt immensely sad, but also had a sense of clarity, relieved of the grief of a hope never realized, a hope that had been the backbone of my life. Breaking ground on my new life shortly after, I took a solo backpacking trip to southern Mexico, including Chiapas, a part of the country where women were rarely seen alone. One day, when touring the ruins of Palenque, a little boy noticed me as I dodged a cluster of fire ants in my path. Aghast, he exclaimed to his parents, "Ella no tiene Alhambra. She doesn't have a man." I guess I was a bit of a novelty to the locals. I'd always have eyes on me when riding in the Colectivo small inner-city commuter vans too. Local women would give me a worried glance, and one of them asked, "Donde queues estás solo? Why are you alone?" I smiled, pointed my finger to the side of my head as I twirled it in a circle, and said, "In Canada, hombre es loco." In Canada, men are crazy. The women in the Colectivo smiled and nodded as if to show me they understood. I took heed to the fact that back home, I could go about my life unencumbered, free from sticking out like a sore thumb. The angst of being single, limited to having no one to share the bills with. Was it Prozac or the puppy? As much as Mexico helped me heal, I still needed a little help. Antidepressants helped rewire my brain so I could begin to see my life differently. Gone was the hoping, pining, and anguish of waiting for a man to come along. But what would I replace it with? It was a she. I named her Ella. I'd always wanted a dog, the way other women might dream of having a child. I had a dog as a kid, but lost him tragically when my parents divorced. The emptiness I'd felt my whole life was now filled with purpose and an unconditional love for my little Ella. Finding a man was no longer even a consideration. I had all I needed in my 40-pound, complicated, hyperactive Labrador cross, living a fulfilled life, single when I put all my focus into creating the life I wanted, rather than waiting for some non-existent man to make me feel complete. I had the space to do so much more. After Ella, I adopted a second dog. Then I bought a fixer house, which kept me busy for 7 years, d'ing it from a shabby, drafty house to a warm and colorful home. My motto was, if the work didn't require a permit, heavy lifting, or heights, I'd take it on. Since I had a house, I rescued a third dog. Alfie was a 125-pound giant. He joined my happy family along with my other 2 dogs and 3 cats. Turns out I was onto something scrolling social media a few months ago. I stumbled upon a post featuring social scientist Bella DePaulo talking about her new book, Single at Heart. DePaulo, herself a lifelong single, describes people who are single at heart as being spared from some of the most painful emotions experienced by single people who really don't want to be single, or the ambiguous loss of yearning to find a lifelong romantic partner, but not knowing whether it will ever happen. I wish I had this book 30 years ago. Red couch and fuchsia rug when I read Will Wolf's story. Why so many women need to be single. Right now, I was reminded of a childhood memory, how women have to stop putting up with demanding, weak men. I was about 10 or 11 when my mother was redecorating the living room. She had a part-time job and had saved up enough money to buy a custom upholstered couch and new carpeting to cover the old, worn hardwood. As she described her plans and showed her samples to my father in the living room one afternoon, the conversation came to an abrupt halt when she mentioned wall-to-wall carpeting, a popular choice in the 70s. Everyone's got it, my mother excitedly explained. I won't have wall-to-wall carpeting in my house. It's a dust magnet, said my father. It's not shag, it's low pile. See, she said. I said no, and my father walked out of the room. My mother's face dropped to the floor as she fiddled with the samples to hide her disappointment. It was a look I was familiar with. No doubt she'd endured countless disappointments with my father, but it never got any easier. She was resigned to it, unwilling or unable to stand up for herself. After a moment of silence, my mother grabbed her cigarettes and told me to go set the table for dinner. The carpet was never spoken of again, but a few weeks later came home from school to find an area rug in the living room. At least the color was the baby blue she wanted. Perhaps in that moment, 5 decades ago, I decided that no husband or boyfriend of mine would ever tell me no. If I wanted a red couch and fuchsia rug, I would get a red couch and fuchsia rug. Maybe I stayed single all my life because I knew I wouldn't compromise and be resigned the way my mother was, especially when my hard-earned money came into play. I do wonder if I'm truly single at heart, or did I choose it out of circumstance, because I gave up on looking for the one? Or maybe I was in denial all those years, and I've always truly meant to be single. At this point, I'm not sure, and does it even matter? Perhaps I'll ponder that thought while I relax on my red couch and dig my toes into my plush fuchsia rug.